My name is Bruce Curry-Alder. I am the Program Leader for Climate Resilience at Canada's International Development Research Centre, and I'm joined today by my colleague Erica Melich, and we'll be presenting a little bit of the thinking that's gone into designing a new initiative called Climate Adaptation and Resilience, or CLARE, which is a research framework for the next number of years that jointly Canada's IDRC and the UK government through the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office will be offering new funding opportunities in order to respond to the climate crisis. So we'll take a step back, explain what are some of the lessons that fed into this design before looking forward into future directions. So let me first say, why are we doing this? What is CLARE? CLARE is intended to be, first and foremost, a fund for research, but it's also a framework within which many projects will be able to be supported and build collectively a community of practice, if you will. Our sort of points of departure as we're crossing this bridge into a new era of partnership is, first of all, the opportunity to do more. We know that we've entered into an era where we no longer need to negotiate the Paris Agreement, but to actually implement climate action. And we've seen just last month, the latest IPCC report that shows the tremendous advances of knowledge that have happened over the past number of years. But the opportunity now is to turn that into impact, to be able to ensure that research knowledge is informing the investments and policies and practices we do to try and realize a more climate resilient future. We've also learned through the past the opportunities of working together to add value, where many projects can come together to be something more than the sum of their parts, and the importance of bringing together diverse coalitions of actors, not just researchers, academics, universities, but engaging not only with government, but private sector entities, civil society, across boundaries and borders. So this added value, the synergies that can be realized by getting different things to work together and communicate, different actors in different places, is part of the purpose, the opportunity we want to seize through a research framework. Throughout this morning and my apologies, and onwards, we'll keep open this online canvas that you can see at the link below, tinyurl.com/CLARE now. In that, you'll have multiple columns. There's at the top of each of the columns a plus sign that you can add your own question or comment on various features that we'll be speaking to today. And we'll be able to respond to some of your questions or comments, whether during the latter part of today's presentation or over the coming weeks, as you may watch this and want to join the conversation. So again, there's the internet address, and we welcome you to gravitate to that online canvas, but we'll also be able to sustain this interaction after today's presentation. So getting into it, what has been the road over the past couple of years, and what do we build on? So CLARE is not coming out of nowhere, but actually is the coming together of the diverse programs you see on the left-hand side of your screen that dealt with agricultural models, climate hotspots, conflict, capacity building, ecosystem services, being able to understand the climate future at a continent level, and its application to humanitarian and emergency situations. What we've done over the past 2 years is really take a step back and look at the deep learning from those investments over the past decade. And some of the high-level experiences have been brought together in this open access chapter. You can see the digital object identifier, the address with a bunch of numbers in blue in the middle of the screen. So you could read more at your own leisure and capacity. But some of the high-level insights we've seen is simplified into the 3 circles you see overlapping. I've already mentioned cohorts, where we can bring multiple teams and projects together to learn from each other and become more than the sum of the parts. That requires some additional investment and some intentionality, and projects also to make sure they don't overly saturate their teams, but leave that openness for emergent opportunities to work with others and seize on opportunities, not only for impact, but also for synergy and synthesis across projects. Working across scale, we've seen the advantages in some of the predecessor programs I've just mentioned of not only working at the local level or at the national, but the ability to realize the connection between the two. So it's much more effective to engage a Ministry of Environment when you've already demonstrated how things work at a district or local level. And there are certain initiatives that can start at a local level, but will run into barriers if they don't have a conducive national context. So working across scale, and again, that's where bringing in those diverse partners matters. And then capacity not just to do research, but be able to get it into action. And the capacity not just of researchers to do research, but of different actors throughout society to be able to understand what is the climate rationale, what specifically is changing, what are the particular risks and impacts that one needs to be adjusting to, and to be able to take action over time. So that sort of broadening of the value chain of capacity, and what does that mean, particularly in terms of who demonstrates leadership in this space. Along the way, we also had other bits of reflection that brought up the further insights you see in the middle column, if you will. I've already mentioned how this is an age of implementation. We don't have to be waiting on pins and needles for the next UN climate conference for the next multilateral agreement. We have one. We just need to move on with it. And we're on the verge of the global stocktake happening next year in 2023. As we see, are we doing enough? Is it adequate and sufficient? Within this, though, it's not just to take action, but to take action that actually favors those that are most disadvantaged in our societies. So being sure that we're undertaking just climate action that enhances equality and inclusion of those who've either been disadvantaged and excluded from development in the past, or stand to lose by some of the investments being made now to address the climate crisis. As well, implicit with everything I've said is that sense of what is the demand, what knowledge is needed by who to be able to achieve this climate action. So the sense of getting knowledge into use and uptake by certain actors to be able to realize that, not just produce more volume and have a thicker UN IPCC assessment report, but be able to ensure that what we know actually influences what we do. Along the way, for organizations like my own at IDRC and the UK government, we've seen that the logic of funding for research in the climate space is increasingly intermingled with the logic of climate finance. So we're no longer being asked only how are we contributing to knowledge, but also how many people are being reached by these investments? To what extent are we helping catalyze, realize transformative change? And this emphasis, again, not just on publications, but how are we helping generate solutions? And what is the advantage or benefit for nature, ecosystems, biodiversity in that? Because as we've been thinking about climate, we also have to realize that there are many non-climate aspects of the environment and our ability to survive and thrive throughout the 21st century we need to embrace. With the announcement of this new program, CLARE, that I'm going to be describing more in a moment, and as a sort of overarching momentary agenda, if you will, the Glasgow Climate Pact, which actually has within it a specific call to the research community. And again, very much in this moment of implementing the Paris Agreement and on the eve of the global stocktake, how can each of our societies really see that research is applied to climate action? All of this has led us to define the following 4 objectives for CLARE. So moving forward, we see the urgent need to accelerate immediate action based on what we already know, continue to drive new knowledge that's needed now to address those needs, enable that broader sense of capacity I mentioned, and really foster inclusive practical action. So that's how we got to this moment. Where do we go from here? So as those predecessor programs are fading a bit into the background, we do see the need to be able to build on each of these objectives and really foster the next generation of projects and investments that help realize practical outputs under each of them. So you see those listed here in terms of tested adaptation tools, data, technologies that are actually used by decision makers and practitioners. Those strong cross-sectoral networks that really help catalyze adaptation action, the enhanced capacity going from research to action, and ensuring that we're feeding into transformational change, not just adapting to the near term, but also aware of what we need by the end of this decade, within the coming decades. All of this has led us to develop a framework, if you will, based on the three themes you see here. And I'll speak about them more in a moment, but also complemented by investments in knowledge sharing and capacity strengthening. So over the next number of years, and very much in front of us, the next COP, but also the Adaptation Futures gathering that will happen in late 2023, these are moments of not just investing in projects, but rallying the scientific and practice communities to realize a better future. So I'm promised to delve into each of the themes a bit more. And these are broad themes, and we do see that they overlap, hence why the circles really fit into each other. But they do speak to particular communities in climate science, humanitarian action, and adaptation practice. So let me just introduce the themes and then some of the justification for them. First, I would say, is risk-informed early action. So the ability to reduce the humanitarian impacts of climate variability on lives and livelihoods. So this is very much driven by responding to disaster risk, if you will, and the things that we know are already happening: floods, droughts, storms, and other events. We also see that there's an ongoing need for understanding climate risks. There is still underpinning science gaps in it to support decision-making, and particularly as we think about what future states of the world will be like, and coverage, where certain parts of the world have had less climate data, less modeling, less relatively available data, so that investments needed now to understand the world that we're about to enter into. And then perhaps the largest of the themes is, how can we continue to develop in a changing climate? So building resilience, particularly amongst the most vulnerable, to address that adaptation gap, that gap between what we know needs to be done and the actual practice. Now, how did we settle on these themes? In part, learning from the past programs, but also taking a wider look around, if you will. And three considerations are illustrated in the two upper corners and the bottom timeline. So if I can draw your attention to the upper left corner, we see that looking across the evidence available to us now, we have a fairly good idea and ability to predict what the weather will be like tomorrow, what it'll be like in 1 week. We have a fairly positive sense of what the different climate futures by the end of the century may be, whether it be 2080 or 2100. It's that middle time gap, if you will, where we see between multiple years and decadal timescale that our ability to really understand what we're about to face is perhaps weakest, yet most urgently needed, whether it be for mortgages, people investing in their own livelihoods, most investment projects in business, infrastructure, really is worried about what's the reality going to be by 2030, 2040, 2050. If we look on the right upper hand corner, we see a mapping done by colleagues Catherine Vincent and Georgina Kundal-Kemp in terms of, at least from three journals, what has been the empiricism that we've seen over the past decade. And in darker blue, you see where more publications have been made available in terms of the adaptation research. Certain parts of Africa and Asia are actually in gray or light blue. This represents where potentially under-researched locations, or locations where at least the knowledge available hasn't been published in the peer-review English language literature. So what's available is either in local languages, the gray literature, less readily accessible. So we see there's opportunities moving forward for being able to address some of the spatial gaps in terms of which parts of the world have adaptation research ready and at the go. And then at the bottom is the timeline. Where are we now? Already at plus 1.1 degree warming from pre-industrial levels. as we head towards 2030 and possibly surpassing the 1.5 degree threshold, there are definite things we can do now that inform that future. In the most immediate term, what can we do now to address some of those existing climate risks I mentioned earlier of droughts, floods, what have you? There's the things that we can invest in now to realize that more climate resilient immediate future. So the investments being made now that have a time horizon of the next number of decades. And then what are the investments we need to do now to have that science that will help us navigate into the longer term future, let's say out by 2050, which is still, again, within the lifespan of an infrastructure investment, a government policy, a mortgage, one's lifespan, if you will. What are the potential gaps under each of these themes? Well, we're not being overly prescriptive. We understand that there are multiple entry points, and both CLARE did its own survey amongst some researchers, but we've just seen and can celebrate the release of the Working Group 2 report from the IPCC. And this slide just brings out some of the potential research questions or topics we expect could be addressed by CLARE over the coming years as a large framework, if you will. We also expect that we'll end up with a balanced portfolio. So as we'll shortly be opening research funding opportunities, we're guided by these considerations. First of all, where are the vulnerable places and what's the focus of CLARE? And CLARE is primarily Africa and Asia Pacific, and with good reason. As we think about different ways of understanding where is the greatest climate vulnerability, and this is just the image taken from that recent IPCC report, there are good reasons for wanting to invest in the places that the impacts are already high and will be high. So that's part of the geographic logic of the program. I mentioned a balance across the themes. So we do expect there will be relatively even investment across the three themes, perhaps a little bit more in development in a changing climate, but also recognizing that these overlap to a certain extent. We also have a strong emphasis on equality and inclusion, as you've probably already heard, and we'll expect within each of these themes, at least one project of each size would be specifically addressing some of the concerns about equality and inclusion and ensuring that the most disadvantaged are able to benefit from climate action. Now, the bottom spectrum, if you will, is a little bit abstract, but let me explain. Each of the dots, if you will, it represents an organization. I mentioned actors. It could be a university. It can be a government department. It can be a non-governmental organization, what have you, private sector entity. What we see is that advantage of bringing coalitions together, being able to enable collaboration within these projects. So in the first instance, we're already done a pre-announcement and we're about to launch a call for large and small projects. In terms of the structure of that, we would expect in large projects, anywhere from 1 to 3 lead organizations that themselves can have collaborative partners. So here you see how that project could be structured, if you will, as a template. In smaller projects that perhaps will have a smaller budget, one can see the opportunity of just having a particular lead organization working with a few collaborating partners, a more simple arrangement for project governance, if you will. We've also entered into conversations with our friends at the Adaptation Research Alliance, who already offer microgrants to organizations to really just initially test out some ideas. And we're just envisioning how action labs might help with the matchmaking and introduction of different actors to be able to test their ideas and then propose opportunities for projects moving forward. So we expect within a couple of years to be able to come back to you and say how this balanced portfolio has developed. Underpinning CLARE, what is the sort of conditions of citizenship, if you will, if one joins and gets funding from the program? We would expect that collectively, the projects will be able to address 4 approaches. First is research for impact. And you've already heard me speak passionately about not just making sure we move forward knowledge and research, but make sure it gets into practice and action. And again, our friends at the Adaptation Research Alliance, based on a substantial evidence review, have defined these 6 principles of what does that mean, very much building on the legacy of decades of participatory action research and what we know about co-production and knowledge translation. We've also been commissioning some work that really helps us understand how does investments in adaptation research interact with and perhaps benefit gender and inclusion within society. And that means not just within the team who participates in the research, but who benefits from it, understanding who gains, who loses, having some aspects of the research agenda that are framed by the question of those inequalities in society. And if you have a moment, I really recommend checking out the short video by our friends who are responsible for the ASAR consortium called Adaptation is People, that really in a few minutes crystallizes some of the key ideas that we're hoping to embed in this framework as we move forward. I would also be remiss if I didn't draw your attention to the box that's in chapter 18 of that new IPCC report that really brings together some of the understanding of the interactions between gender and climate, what we know now and what we have to know better over the next while. I've already mentioned capacity strengthening and how that has to be across this value chain or spectrum, and not just of research, but the ability to communicate, share, and act on that. And each of these are not just based on our short presentation today, but have a deep scoping study behind them. And again, the links are there if you wanted to learn more. I've also mentioned the importance of diverse and equitable partnerships. And what you see in the bottom right corner is simply the arrangement of the core organizations that were leading the CARIA program previously, and shows how diverse organizations come together, each of which are bringing their own competencies. It is exactly the complementarity of what each of these organizations offer, whether it be geographic coverage, their particular skills, resources, their reach to particular audiences. It's in working together that they're able to realize something that's more than they could do on their own. And that requires work. It also requires making clear why does a set of organizations work together, who does what is the mutual accountability. And again, we have a scoping paper that's really looked back at what we've experienced in the past and how to be even better at that moving forward. So collectively, 3 research themes, each of which will have a set of projects under them. And then CLARE, as a larger program, really intends to build the collaborative spaces to be able to build across. So not only being able to ensure that what's happening within individual projects adds up to something at that theme level, but also working across in terms of having working groups in different areas. In the first instance, the 4 approaches I just mentioned a moment ago, but really being able to become more than the sum of our parts, having not just planned learning fora, but also emergent opportunities that we'll be able to seize moving forward. The things that we can't yet see beyond the global stocktake next year, that may be an opportunity. In the past, a program that launched in 2014 was able to quickly pivot and feed into the IPCC report on 1.5 degree warming. We don't know exactly what the opportunities over the next number of years will be, but we will be ready for them. And again, we're basing this on some experience. And again, the links are in the bottom left corner if you wanted to follow up on those at your own leisure. And there is a larger world out there. So I mentioned our friends at the Adaptation Research Alliance. This was just announced at the last UN climate conference, but already has more than 120 member organizations that are coming together to really help understand what are the needs, where are the opportunities to scale investment in adaptation research and make a difference. And IDRC and FCDO are pleased to be part of this. We've already seen not just the evidence review that's in the sort of middle of the 3 reports you see there, but also been doing some of the consultation about what are the needs and opportunities in climate and food systems, or again, gender equality and social inclusion. And those are now available publicly in multiple languages for anyone to be able to pick up on and be able to place their interests in a larger set of priorities, if you will. I would just be remiss if I didn't bring in this one graphic from the latest IPCC report. What you've seen up until now really is framed by this type of futures thinking, if you will. We know we're in the moment of climate crisis, and the decisions, investments made over the next number of years will put us on a society, as our societies, on a path towards a more climate resilient future, the green or maybe yellowish line, or will continue eroding and will become more exposed to greater risk, which is more the orange and red lines. So collectively, if I can point to an overarching logic for CLARE, it is how can we act together as the research community, engage with our societies to generate and share knowledge that gets us more towards those pathways that create greater opportunities for climate resilience, that really transform ourselves to be able to adapt to the imminent climate future, and one where we realize better human dignity and development for all. So in sort of wrapping up, if you will, we've already had a pre-announcement about those larger and smaller funding opportunities that are about to open. We're working feverishly behind the scenes to launch a call for concept notes across those 3 themes. And we will be moving towards a process that we expect will get projects started as early 2023. So the next number of months will be about selection and refinement of project ideas to be able to join CLARE moving forward. And if you had any particular questions on any of the approaches I've outlined or the themes, those are the columns that are available in the online canvas now. And we also invite you to follow us over time to watch for news in idrc.ca/CLARE moving forward. So with that, maybe I'll pause here and ask Erica if you want to come in to add any of your own comments, or if we're seeing anything coming in from online, and turn the conversation over to you.
Thanks very much, Bruce, and everyone who's joining us today live or in watching the recording in the future, as Bruce mentioned. I've popped the link to the conversation Padlet into chat again, so that's available for anyone that would like to comment. Again, we have the different sections of some of the different areas of work and the different kind of themes that CLARE will be dealing with: research for impact, gender and inclusion, capacity strengthening, diverse and equitable partnerships, and then something more on the research theme, funding opportunities. As Bruce mentioned, we are behind the scenes getting ready to launch very soon, so do watch this space. A lot of exciting information to be able to share soon. But now I think we'll open it up if there are any questions. Happy to take any comments, questions, or get the conversation going. So thanks, Bruce.
Great. At this moment, I should be sharing my screen so you can see what an online canvas looks like. This is, if we were all in a room, we could have a whiteboard or a wall with sticky notes. This is intended to serve that type of purpose. In the presentation, we outlined 4 approaches that really underpin the investments CLARE hopes to make over time. And those are the first 4 columns you see here. So research for impact, gender and inclusion, capacity strengthening, and diverse and equitable partnerships. And again, the links to the deeper bits of thinking, reflection, synthesis that fed into those are there for your own reading pleasure at your own leisure. The research themes is the fifth column on this, and the funding opportunities, the ones that we hope to open shortly, and the very simple dynamic of how we would expect organizations might work together, arrange themselves. In these types of online Canvas, once you enter with the link that had been shared in the chat, you can just hit a plus sign like this to add some fantastic idea or question of your own, or alternatively, you can just add straight to the column, add a comment in the yellow box along the way. And as I mentioned, we appreciate that we're speaking across several time zones. Indeed, parts of Asia are probably already asleep or should be shortly. And this will remain open over the next number of days, and we'll continue to watch it as we move forward. Indeed, the next few weeks, we'll be not only launching that call for concept notes, but also having an information webinar that goes over much of the same information we're doing right now.
So I just see a question that's come in on where the links were sent to. So we have put the link to that Padlet called into the chat, and I'll just post that again. So feel free to interact directly through that, and hopefully you're able to see that Zoom chat. If not, you can type the tinyurl.com/CLARE now into your screens, and we'll be able to see anything you type there as well.
And Lucia, thank you for joining us today. And if there's any problem using the online Canvas, I invite anyone to use the Q&A feature as well. So I see one autonomous attendee says thank you already, but we'll look forward to any contributions being made through the online Canvas, the Padlet, or the Q&A feature through the Zoom call as well. If we don't receive much in the next little bit, maybe we will just pause early and say that we've done what we needed to do, which was just introduce the flavor of what's the thinking that brought us into CLARE, what are some of the future directions, and look forward to continuing the conversation not over the next month, but also the next years, as we'll probably be coming back to Gobeshona and other events. So I see that Lucia's asked about the action labs, and this is really just in this ideation stage right now, but we've been doing a bit of reflecting, and Eric, I'll ask you to come in with your own ideas in a moment on the research commissioning process. How can we get better at identifying the next projects? And there is perhaps a certain bias if we just go straight to asking great organizations to give us great ideas. How do those ideas come into existence in the first place? So the thinking behind possibly having action labs, and we haven't yet sort of peg this down, is where are those opportunities for people to find each other? As my colleague Georgina sometimes says, that's the sort of critical emergent element of collaboration, is creating conditions where people can really understand, get to know who's out there, and then spark up conversations. So where that may be what's behind the Action Lab. Some other funders over time have talked about sand pits or project development workshops. We really just want to sort of convene some of those conversations that go from identifying needs and opportunities for research to actually saying, okay, so who wants to do something about this? And maybe you don't have a solid team or proposal yet, but you have an interest and you have a knowledge of what you have to offer. So see where those collaborations can emerge from. Erica, any further thoughts? You've been embedded with us along the way of thinking about how to do better at research commissioning.
So I think building off of what you just shared, Bruce, one of the things that didn't come out as strongly through the presentation is that there is going to be a strong focus on what we're referring to as novel partnerships or diverse partnerships. and Southern leadership. So tying into who the partners are that are making up these teams and how do we make sure we're getting diverse types of actors. It'll be in a lot of these links that you'll see, but just to sort of bring a bit of a focus on that for a moment. So one idea, as Bruce mentioned, is could we have some sort of action lab, but that's very much in a beginning stage of thinking. For the research commissioning process itself, the concept, it'll be a two-stage process, and there'll be a call for concept notes originally, and this will be open for at least 8 weeks to allow teams to be able to find themselves and to be able to put together who their partners might be. And this might be, a research organization paired with other types of organizations, or it might be different folks that are leading different types of themes. And we're inviting proposals or concept notes around these different types of ways of thinking about it. So that's what I'll add. Thanks.
Great. So I appreciate that not everyone could join us online today. We actually have a fairly modest audience, but if there's other questions, comments, or further reactions, feel free to share that in the Q&A in the online canvas if you can. And again, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We've been able to get to this point now where we can say CLARE actually exists. And just to share a bit of the excitement that we have is not only did we strive to get to that announcement for the UN Climate Conference back in November, but literally last week, the IDRC Board of Governors has said, yep, okay, that makes sense. And we're off to the races. So what we've done in the sense is preview something that really starts to exist on Friday. Everything we've done up until now has been getting to this point, but it's now definitely signed, sealed between our organizations. This partnership that we envision will be over the next decade, but definitely we're working now on delivering the next 5 years.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And I'm seeing a question coming in under the funding opportunities of our pilot, asking if a private sector joins a consortium, how well would a young business who is just integrating climate knowledge and risk management into their approach be perceived by the funder? Would a well-established business?
That's a great question, and I'll read it more in detail. I'm just going to respond to exactly what you've just said, Erica. And I think in the first instance, I can say favorably. We're looking to diversify, if you will, not just funding researchers to do research, but also the ability to engage folks across society, including private sector. If I look back at some of the past investments where we saw things work really well in the predecessor programs, the PRIZE Consortium actually did a lot of work looking at the climate resilience of SMEs in Africa, or of value chains for livestock, for milk, for meat, for leather, and really understanding where can one target investments to really help the sector, or if as a small and medium enterprise, how does one experience climate shocks and recover from that over time or not, and what's needed to actually really understand one's exposure and ability to address them. Again, we're looking for knowledge as, forgive the analogy, contact sport, that we're actually able to bring different organizations together to be able to realize that potential for action and greater value and become more climate resilient in the future, not just generate more reports. So I would say in the first instance, quite favorably. And indeed, the whole idea of action labs is there could be a large community out there of people who don't already have a set of collaborating partners, but have an interest and obviously a position. So whether you're a private sector entity, a young career researcher, maybe you're a knowledge broker, or you're a think tank for policy in a particular place, what you have to offer in terms of your contacts, your skills, your resources, where you work, all of that can really add value to working with others that have different competencies or different things to offer. So we are attentive to that, which is why we've been playing around with some of the language, but this sense of diverse and equitable partnerships, and that sense that these relationships should not be exploitative, they should be of mutual benefit. So if a private sector entity works with researchers, a knowledge broker, with local officials or government, that each are feeling like they're benefiting somehow and bringing something to that collaboration. Erica, any thoughts of your own on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and as you kind of alluded to, Bruce, it's really how the organizations who join a consortium or who join a project will be able to help get to the goals that the project wants to achieve, and those goals in line with what the vision of the program is. So there's a key role for a young business. And that's what they're able to bring really contributes to that. Of course, that would be a very valuable partner to have, and that would have potentially a great contribution. One quick kind of caveat will be that if whoever's going to be a lead organization will have to have a granting relationship with IDRC. So there are some sort of legal components involved with who can receive funds, but all of that will be covered in the eligibility criteria that will be posted when the call is launched. So just to sort of flag that, as long as certain criteria are met, then the partners are welcome to join.
Great, and just to say, this is our first call. It's perhaps the broadest call, the one that's looking across the themes. We do anticipate there will be future calls as well. So if you don't have a team immediately ready to seize next week, if you will, or in the 8-week plus period that Erica pointed to, there will be other opportunities we envision, but they'll likely be more focused on the particular gap that we see within the emergent portfolio, whether geographically, thematically, or what have you. So perhaps we've run out of steam, but maybe one last invitation to yourself, Erica. Anything I forgot or you would really like to emphasize from the presentation? You're thinking of, CLARE, our aspirations moving forward, anything you'd like to sort of signal to the community watching now or will watch us afterwards?
I think most of the important points have been covered, Bruce, at least that we're able to share at this point in time. But as we mentioned, more will come very soon in this space. I think Bruce shared the link to the webpage, which is IDRC CLARE. And if you keep an eye on that space or follow IDRC's funding calls, when this is launched very soon, there'll be a lot more details on what this will be. But of course, we love engaging with everyone and hearing the questions and the excitement and the ideas that are out there. So this is a really great discussion. And last moment for any questions, I suppose, before we wrap up.
I suggest we'll pause here and thank you, Lucia, Sarah, others that have joined us today, and look forward to continuing to have a conversation moving forward. It's been a couple of years where we've been a little bit inward looking, getting all of those approvals, setting up the program. But as you can see from the rich number of links we've been able to share, there's a rich amount of learning and a lot that we have yet to learn with you over the next number of years. So thank you for your time, whether you're joining us now live or catching up on this over the next coming weeks. And again, Erica and I, on behalf of IDRC, will be monitoring that online canvas, the Padlet, if there's any other questions that come up or comments as well. So we're looking forward to being part of this larger community under the Adaptation Research Alliance, moving towards Adaptation Futures 2023 and really realizing the potential that our community has to get research into action. So with that, I'll bid you good night, good afternoon, or the rest of your good morning, depending on where you are.